I never realized that an ordinary evening could change my life so drastically. It all started on that quiet fall evening when Emily came home. We'd been together for 10 years, and in that time I'd come to love her in a way that seemed impossible to love anyone else. She was my rock, my inspiration, my everything. But that night, everything changed. I remember her walking into the house a little later than usual. Her face was serious, but at the same time she had a strange, almost unaccustomed smile playing on it. I was sitting in the living room, finishing the dinner I'd made myself. Usually we ate together, but today she was late. "Hi, John." Her voice sounded uncertain, like she was struggling to find the words. "We need to talk." The words made me tense. I put aside the book I was holding and looked at her. Her gaze was focused, but there was something in it that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Of course," I answered, trying not to give away my anxiety. She sat down across from me, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly. Emily had never looked so hesitant. She usually spoke her thoughts with confidence, but now something was holding her back. "John," she began, pausing. "I've been thinking about this for a long time." Her voice trembled, and I felt my heart squeeze. "I want us to try to open our marriage." Those words echoed in my head. In that minute, I felt everything I knew about our life fracture. Our marriage always seemed strong to me. We were the couple that all our friends thought was perfect. We met in college, went through ups and downs together. I remember the day I proposed to her, at sunset on the beach, to the sound of the waves. Emily said yes, and I thought our union would be unbreakable. After she said it, I didn't immediately find what to say. My first reaction was a mixture of surprise and confusion. "An open marriage?" I asked again, as if I didn't fully understand what she meant. "Yes," she answered, lowering her eyes. "I think it might help us freshen things up." Her words sounded as if she'd prepared this speech in advance, but I couldn't understand why she suddenly decided that we needed something to freshen things up. "Emily, I don't understand. We've always been happy, haven't we?" "We have been," she said, and I could see her lips tighten. "But lately, I feel like something's missing." I tried to digest what I was hearing. We'd always been honest with each other. If something was bothering her, why didn't she tell me sooner? Why did she think that was the solution? "Do you really think this is going to help?" I asked, feeling my voice treacherously shaky. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window as if searching for an answer. "I don't know, John. I just want to try." I tried to find some hint of humor in her words, but she was serious. That seriousness was the thing that scared me the most. Later that night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. We never continued our conversation. Emily went to bed first, and I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Hundreds of questions swirled around in my head. Why did she suggest it? Was I not good enough for her? Or was she just tired of me? The next morning, I woke up before she did. The morning was gloomy, and even coffee couldn't dispel the fog in my head. I could feel the tension rising, but I didn't know how to deal with it. The next day, I tried to act like nothing had happened. Emily acted familiar, as if our conversation last night was just a hazy dream. She poured herself a coffee, looked up the news on her phone, nodded at me, but avoided making eye contact. I knew this was just the beginning, and that sooner or later we'd be back on the subject. I pondered her words all morning, trying to make sense of them. Her desire to refresh the relationship sounded like something people discuss in fancy articles about marriage, but not in our lives. We were an ordinary couple, and I always thought that made us happy. "Are you concerned about something?" she finally asked, looking up from her cup of coffee. "What do you think?" I didn't mean to sound sarcastic, but the words came out on their own. She paused, set the cup on the table, and folded her hands in her lap. "John, I know it's hard, but I just want us to be honest with each other." Honesty. That word hit me harder than I expected. "Honest? You want me to believe that this is all about us? For our marriage?" I asked, feeling the irritation building inside me. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I think it's a way to get back what we had." "Back what?" I stood up from the table, feeling a wave of anger wash over me. "I thought we were good." She didn't answer. Instead, Emily looked away again, and I saw her lips twitch, as if she were trying to hold back tears. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I should have said something earlier." I walked out of the kitchen, unable to continue the conversation. I knew that if I stayed, I'd say something I'd regret. The day passed in a blur. I left for work, but thoughts of Emily and her proposal didn't let me go for a minute. I tried to work, but every task seemed pointless. My coworkers noticed my absent-mindedness, but no one dared to ask what was wrong. In the evening when I got home, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Emily was sitting in the living room, covered with a blanket, watching television, though she didn't seem to be paying attention to the screen. "Had you thought about it?" she asked as I walked past her. I stopped without turning around. Emily, I can't just accept this like you suggested changing the color of the wallpaper. This is our marriage. This is our life. She stood up and walked over to me. I felt her hand gently touch my shoulder. I know, but I want you to understand that this isn't about you. I turned around sharply, looking her in the eye. Not because of me? Then who is it about, Emily? Have you found someone yet? The words came out before I could stop them. Her face went pale, and I realized I'd hit the mark. She looked away, but I could see her fingers clench into a fist. I don't want to lie to you, John, she whispered. The words sounded like a knife to my heart. So there is someone out there, isn't there? I asked, already knowing the answer. She was silent, and that silence said more than any words could. I stepped back slowly, feeling the world crumble around me. Everything I knew, everything I believed in, seemed to disappear in an instant. I can't talk to you right now, I said, trying to keep my emotions in check. I need to be alone. I walked out of the house, slamming the door. The cold night air hit my face, but I didn't even feel it. All I could think about were her words and what they meant. I wandered through the empty streets, oblivious to the time. The night lights of the city blended into a monochromatic blur, and 1,000 thoughts swirled in my head. Everything I knew about our marriage was an illusion. The thought that Emily might have had someone else was tearing me up inside. I stopped at the park where Emily and I had once taken frequent walks. It was quiet, with only the faint rustle of the wind in the leaves. I sat down on a bench and cradled my face in my palms. What had I done wrong? Where had we taken a wrong turn? Memories came in waves. The first time I saw Emily, her laugh, her eyes, her awkward movements as she tried to impress me. We'd always been everything to each other. Or was that just what I thought? My phone vibrated. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw a message from Emily. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen. Let's talk. I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing what to say back. The words seemed meaningless. I wanted to believe that this could be fixed, but deep down I knew that everything had changed forever. When I got home, I saw that the light in the living room was still on. Emily was sitting on the couch, hugging her knees. She looked small and confused, as if she didn't know what to do. Do you want to talk? She asked, looking up at me. I want to understand, I answered. I want to know why you thought this was the way out. She was silent for a moment, and then she took a deep breath. John, I feel like we've become strangers to each other. I don't know how to explain it, but sometimes I feel like we just exist side by side instead of living together. That's no excuse to look for someone else, I interrupted. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why did you think an open marriage was the solution? Because I was afraid, her voice shook. Scared that if I told you about it, you'd leave. Leave? Emily, do you understand how I feel right now? Do you understand that this is a betrayal to me? She pressed her lips together and looked away. I do, I know it hurts, but I really thought it was best for us. Better? For us? Or for you? I looked at her, trying to find an answer in her eyes, but all I saw was fear and guilt. In that moment, I realized that there was an abyss between us. Everything I knew, everything I loved was a lie. That night ended in silence. I retired to the bedroom, leaving her alone in the living room. Lying on the bed, I stared up at the ceiling, feeling my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. I knew we had a difficult conversation ahead of us, but there was a cold fire of distrust burning inside me. I couldn't shake the question. If I agreed to her terms, would I ever be able to trust her again? The next day, I woke up feeling heavy, as if the night had brought no relief. There was a ringing silence in the house. Emily was gone. She'd left early that morning, leaving a note on the table. We need time. I'll be back tonight. Please think about everything. Those words caused me to feel a strange mixture of relief and anger. She left, giving me space to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just run away. I spent the entire day in a sort of automatic mode. Breakfast brought no flavor. Work was going from bad to worse. Thoughts of Emily and what she'd said and what it meant for us didn't let me go for a second. By lunchtime, I realized I had to figure out where those cracks started. When did things go wrong? We've always been a team, always solved things together, but now I felt like I was living with a stranger whose motives I couldn't figure out. These reflections brought me back to the past. I remembered the year when we first encountered real difficulties. I had then just started a new job that required long hours and constant stress. Emily, on the other hand, was searching for herself, trying one hobby after another, but none of them were satisfying. I remembered how often we fought over nothing. I would come home tired and she would greet me with reproaches. At the time, I thought it was just a temporary phase, that things would get better. We'd make up, hug, and I thought love was coming back. But now I realized that we were just plugging the holes, not solving the real problem. In the evening, Emily came home. She entered the house quietly, as if she was afraid to disturb the air. I sat in the living room looking out the window, but I could hear her footsteps. "You're home," she said, as if surprised. "Of course I am," I answered. "Where else would I be?" She was silent, and I could feel the tension between us. "I want to talk," she said finally. "Good. I want to understand something too," I turned to her. "Tell me honestly, Emily, is this about someone?" She froze, her face whiter than paper. "Why do you ask?" Her voice sounded weaker than usual. "Because I can feel it. You've changed. You're different. I don't want to guess. I want to know the truth." Emily sank down on the couch, her hands clasped together. She wouldn't look at me. "Yes," she said finally, barely audible. The short word struck me like a bolt of lightning. I'd expected that answer, but hearing it from her lips was different. "Who is he?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It doesn't matter," she answered. "It's not about him, John. It's about us." "No, Emily, it is about him." I stood up, feeling the anger building inside me. "You can't say there's a third person in our marriage that doesn't matter." "John, I didn't mean for things to turn out this way." Her eyes glistened with tears. "But you let it happen," I interrupted. "You made a choice." She didn't say anything. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I couldn't sympathize anymore. All my feelings were frozen under the weight of her confession. "If you want to be with him, then why all this talk about an open marriage? Why didn't you just go to him?" Her face contorted in pain, and I realized I'd hit the mark. "Because I don't want to lose you, John," she whispered. "I love you." The words knocked the ground out from under me. "How can you say you love me and betray me at the same time?" "Love?" I asked again. "That doesn't sound like love, Emily. It's like selfishness." She tried to move closer, but I pulled back. "You want it all at once," I continued. "You want to leave me, but you want to keep an escape route. It doesn't work that way." She burst into tears, but I couldn't comfort her anymore. I could feel something inside me dying. "I don't know if I can survive this," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "But all I know right now is that something is broken between us, and I don't know if it can be fixed." That night passed in silence. I slept on the couch, though my sleep was restless and interrupted by painful thoughts. The next morning I woke up with an emptiness inside. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. Emily and I weren't the same person we used to be. The next morning started out feeling heavy, like I was carrying a weight on my shoulders that was getting heavier and heavier. Emily had left for work earlier than usual, leaving behind only the faint smell of her perfume in the hallway. For the first time in a while, I realized that her absence gave me more peace than her presence. I sat at the kitchen table, staring into my cold coffee. It seemed like the whole house had absorbed her betrayal. Every detail around me, the pictures, her things, even the old plaid on the couch, shouted how deeply she'd been woven into my life. At work, I tried to distract myself, but it didn't work. Colleagues noticed my depressed state, but no one dared to ask what was wrong. Only my boss, Richard, came up to me at lunchtime. "John, you're not yourself today. Is everything all right?" His voice was friendly, but I knew he was expecting an answer. I wondered if I should share. Richard was older than me and had been married for years. He could probably give me advice, but telling him what was going on in my family felt wrong. "Just personal problems," I answered evasively. He nodded, but his eyes were understanding. "If you want to talk, let me know." I nodded back, grateful for his delicacy. I got home later than usual that evening. Emily was already home, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine. When she saw me, she set the glass on the table and stood up. "John, we need to talk," she said. "We've had enough talking, Emily," I replied, taking off my coat. "No, I'm serious." She stepped closer, but kept her distance, as if she was afraid of my reaction. "We can't live like this. It's killing us both." "You ruined it," I said, looking at her. "You thought our marriage was something you could mold to your desires." She sighed, clasping her hands together. "I know I'm to blame, but I still want to save us." "How?" I felt my anger boiling up inside me again. "How are you going to do that? You want me to agree to your terms? You want me to pretend that it's okay for me to share you with someone else?" She didn't answer right away, and that silence spoke more than her words. "I want to understand you," she finally said. "I want you to give me a chance to explain." I looked at her and realized that despite all the pain, I still wanted to hear her. Maybe it was because deep down, I'd been hoping for something that would explain what she was doing. "Okay," I said, sitting down on the couch. "Explain." She sat down across from me, took the glass, and took a small sip. "It all started about a year ago," she began. "I sensed that something had changed between us. You'd become more withdrawn, more absorbed in your work. I tried to talk to you, but you didn't seem to notice that anything was bothering me." "And that justifies your betrayal?" I asked, not hiding my sarcasm. "No," she answered quickly. but I want you to understand how I felt. She paused for a moment as if gathering her thoughts. Then I met him. It started by chance. We talked, shared our worries. I didn't want it to go that far, but, it did. I clenched my fists, trying to control myself. And now you want me to just accept it? You want me to close my eyes? No, she said. I want us to start over. I grinned bitterly. A fresh start? After everything that's happened? How do you envision it? John, I know I was wrong, but I still love you. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Her words sounded sincere, but I had a hard time believing her. My heart was broken and I wasn't sure it could be put back together again. I don't know, Emily, I said finally. I need time. She nodded and I saw tears glisten in her eyes. I understand, she whispered, but please give us a chance. That night passed in silence again. I lay in the bedroom thinking about her words, about her confession, about whether I could ever forgive her. But one question kept echoing in my head. Was it worth it to try to keep what was probably already lost? I woke up the next day with a heavy heart, still digesting her words. Emily had gone to work, leaving the house empty and cold. I took the day off, deciding I needed time to figure out how to move on. Sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, I replayed her confessions in my head. Her saying that she still loved me seemed both sincere and empty at the same time. If she loved me, how could she do that? I decided I needed a distraction. I went to the garage where my old tool collection stood. I used to love to craft, to build things with my hands, but in recent years, I hadn't had much time for it. I took out a piece of wood and started working on it, trying to get rid of the chaos in my head. But even that didn't help. I couldn't let go of Emily. I kept going back to her words, to her tears, to her promises to make things right. Could I believe her? Should I try? That evening when Emily came home, I was already waiting for her in the living room. She looked tired, but when she saw me, she froze in the doorway, as if she hadn't expected me to want to talk. John, she said, setting her bag by the door. Have you decided something? I nodded, but I couldn't find the words right away. I've decided that we need some time apart, I said finally. Her face paled and she stepped toward me. Apart, you want to leave? No, I held up my hand to stop her. But I can't just forget everything you told me right now. I can't pretend everything's okay. We both need time to figure out what we want. She was silent for a moment, then sat down quietly on the couch. I understand, she said, though her voice shook. If you think it will help, I don't know if it will help, I admitted. But I know that I can't be there for you now like I used to be. Emily lowered her head and I saw her shoulders shake. I'm sorry, John, she whispered. I never meant for it to end like this. Maybe it's not over, I said, though I wasn't sure what I meant. But we'd both have to work at it. The next day I packed my things and went to a friend's house who asked me to stay with him for a while. He didn't ask me anything, just silently offered me a beer and said, if you want to talk, I'm here. I was grateful to him for that. Days passed that blended into weeks. Emily texted me, sometimes called, but I couldn't answer her right away. I needed space to sort myself out. I thought back to our best moments, trying to figure out if there was anything real in them that was worth saving. One night, I finally decided to meet her. We chose a small cafe where we used to frequent together. Emily looked tired, but I could see that there was a spark of hope in her eyes. John, thanks for coming, she began. I've been thinking a lot, I said. I realized that if we wanted to keep what we had to start from scratch. Her eyes widened. Are you ready to give it a try? Yes, but on a condition, I answered. We go to couples therapy and no more secrets, no more hiding. Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes, John. That conversation didn't solve all of our problems, but it was the first step toward recovery. That night, I realized that forgiveness was a long road, but maybe it was worth it if there was even the slightest chance of regaining what had been lost. It had been a few weeks since that evening when Emily and I decided to give our marriage another chance. Life seemed as shaky as the thin ice beneath our feet. One false step, and it would all come crashing down. We both realized that the road to recovery would be long and painful, but I decided to give it a try. Emily found a family therapist, and our first session was scheduled for Saturday. I didn't know what to expect, but I was determined. I wanted to see if trust and love could be regained, or if this was just an attempt to delay the inevitable. Saturday morning, we arrived at the cozy office where we were greeted by a middle-aged woman with kind but stern eyes. She introduced herself as Dr. Rachel Harper. Her voice was soft but confident. John, Emily, welcome. I realize this is a difficult time for you, but your willingness to work on yourself is a big step forward. Emily and I nodded, each of us trying to find our footing in our own way. The session began with Dr. Harper asking us to tell her how we saw our problems. Emily started first. I know I hurt John. My betrayal broke our trust, and I feel like I have to rebuild it now. Her voice shook, but she kept talking, recounting her doubts, fears, and mistakes. I listened in silence, trying to suppress my anger. When it was my turn, I was silent for a long time, gathering my thoughts. It's hard for me, I said at last. I feel betrayed. To me, our marriage was something unbreakable, something we'd built over the years, and now it feels like a lie. Dr. Harper nodded, listening intently. John, your feelings are perfectly natural. You're experiencing a loss of trust, and it's one of the most difficult emotions to deal with. Emily, you're going to have to be patient and willing to prove your loyalty if you want to rebuild the relationship. The words were simple, but they were the essence of our situation. We both had work to do, each in our own way. After the session, we went home, immersed in our own thoughts. I noticed that Emily was trying. She was no longer hiding her emotions, asking me how my day was, suggesting that we spend time together. But I still felt a barrier between us, an invisible wall that couldn't be broken. In the evenings, we sometimes sat together, but talking was hard. One day, I couldn't stand it and asked her a question that kept bugging me. Emily, do you still think about him? She looked up at me with eyes full of sadness. No, John, she said honestly. I cut all ties. He was no longer a part of my life. But you loved him, didn't you? My voice was quieter than I'd expected. Emily closed her eyes as if the words hurt her. I thought I did, she said. But it wasn't love. It was an escape. From you, from our problems, from myself. Her confession didn't make me feel any better, but I sensed she was telling the truth. We continued to go to therapy, and with each session I felt a little better. I began to realize that the problem wasn't just her cheating, but that we both missed the moment when we needed to talk to each other. One day, Dr. Harper suggested an exercise for us: write letters to each other. In these letters, we had to express everything we felt without fear of being misunderstood. I sat over a blank sheet of paper for a long time, not knowing where to begin. But when the first words hit the paper, the rest flowed by themselves. Emily, when I met you, I thought I'd found my person. You were everything to me: friend, partner, lover. When you betrayed me, I felt like I'd lost not only you, but a part of myself. It hurts, but I want to try to forgive you, because despite everything, I still love you. But I need you to show me that it won't happen again, that I can trust you again. When I finished, I felt strangely relieved. The next day, I gave the letter to Emily. She read it silently, but I saw her eyes fill with tears. Thank you, John, she said, clutching the letter in her hands. It means more to me than you know. She wrote me a letter too, confessing her guilt and telling me how much she wanted our love back. Those letters were a turning point. We started communicating openly, without fear to talk about our feelings. It was difficult, but I felt that something real was rekindling between us. Gradually, I began to forgive her. It was not an overnight decision, but a long process in which I tried to put the past behind me. After a few months, we decided to take a small vacation to be alone together. It was an attempt to start from scratch, to go back to the times when we were happy. That vacation became something of a second chance for us. We laughed again, held hands, talked late into the night. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that we had a future. Sometimes I still thought about her cheating on me. Those thoughts didn't disappear completely, but I learned to live with them. I realized that forgiveness was a choice that had to be made every day, and as long as I was willing to choose her, I knew we had a chance. 6 months after that fateful night, our lives began to slowly change. We still went to couples therapy every week, and those sessions became something of an anchor that kept us from finally drowning in our emotions. Emily did her best. She was no longer staying out late, no longer distracted by her phone, and she spent all her free time with me. But despite her best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow of her infidelity still lingered between us. Every time I looked at her, a question would pop into my mind. Why did she do that? Was I not good enough? These thoughts were eating me up inside, even though I tried to fight them. One night, as we sat in the kitchen, I dared to bring up something we had long avoided talking about. Emily, I began, trying to keep my voice calm. How do you think we're doing? She looked up at me, her eyes tired, but there was still a spark of hope in them. I want to believe we are, she answered, but I know you're still hurting. I nodded, acknowledging that she was right. Yes, it does. Sometimes it feels like I'll never be able to let it go. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. I understand, John, but I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. The words sounded sincere, but I knew they wouldn't solve our problems. We had a long way to go. As time went on, I began to notice small changes. We talked more than before, not just about problems, but about little things, books, movies, even weekend plans. These conversations became our way of reestablishing our lost connection. One day I suggested to Emily that we go to the mountains together, as we had done in the early years of our marriage. She agreed enthusiastically, and I sensed that she really wanted to regain what we had lost. The trip turned out to be therapeutic. We walked the trails, talked about how we once dreamed of having our own home, of having children. At one point, standing at the top of a hill, I looked at her and realized that I could see in her eyes again the woman I had fallen in love with. "Thank you for still being here," I said quietly. Emily hugged me, and I felt some of the weight I'd been carrying all this time lifted from my shoulders. Our life hadn't been perfect. There were days when the memories came flooding back, and I felt the pain I'd experienced that night again. But I'd learned to talk about it. Emily listened, not defending herself, not making excuses, just accepting my words. It was helping. We continued to build our marriage anew, one step at a time. It wasn't an easy road, but I realized that forgiveness was not a weakness, but a strength. I chose to forgive every day because I realized that love is not just a feeling, but an action, a decision to be there for each other even when it's hard. A year after her confession, we were sitting on the terrace of our house, enjoying a warm summer evening. Emily held my hand, and I felt that for the first time in a long time, we had a future. Sometimes the pain would return, but it no longer controlled me. I learned to live with it because I realized it was part of life, part of love. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was our story. And in that story, despite everything we went through, I still chose her.